crashed in Plainfield in 1960 after its crew accidentally bailed out of it way over on the other side of New York. And that, in fact, is a pretty amazing story in itself. So I'll talk about the Camels Hump story. And all I have time, even in the 90-minute presentation, to tell you the highlights of the story. It is so deep. There's so much to this story. It involves presidents of the United States, famous actors, that sort of thing. As you'll see that as we go through this. And let's see here. Trying to get my slides to advance. So this is a letter from the tail gunner. There were 10 men on the plane. This is 7 days before the crash. And this expresses the attitude of all of the airmen that were on board. Yes, sir, I think this Air Corps can't be beat. And take a look at that face. You can see he's 18, I think 18 years old, as I recall. People don't realize in World War II that bomber crews were not what you see in the movies today, like the current series that's running on, I think it's Netflix. The movie Memphis Belle features all these actors in their 30s and 40s. Well, that's not who fought World War II in the air. It was teenagers that fought the war. If you can imagine going down to the airport and getting into an airliner flown by an 18-year-old, you'd be horrified. But in World War II, that was pretty normal. So I started this research in 1964 as a kid when I was 12, when one of my buddies first took me up the mountain. I saw the wreckage and I went home that night and I started asking my parents about it. They didn't know anything about it. My teachers at school didn't know anything about it. So I started puttering around. The date showing there is 2021. That's when I created this PowerPoint. The research is still continually going on today. This gives you an idea of the size of the plane and the look of the plane that hit Camels Hump. This bomber shown here, this is a B-24 Liberator. It was made by Ford Motor Company. They were making these things at 1 an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during World War II. And they made over 18,000 of these things. And the one that hit Camels Hump looked very close to the one that you see right here. This was actually at the Burlington Airport the following year. This is how they made them at Ford Motor Company. Each one cost around $250,000 back then, or $3.9 million in today's money. But you can see here how Ford manufacture them on an assembly line. Imagine this, 1 an hour, 24 hours a day is how they were pumping these things out. So I always wanted to find a photograph of this bomber, the one that hit Camels Hump, before it hit Camels Hump. And after several years of research, I finally found at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Alabama a 16 millimeter microfilm of Westover Field, Massachusetts during World War II, because that's where this bomber was from. It's outside of Springfield. It's actually in Chicopee, Mass. And on the microfilm, and they had this photo, you can sort of make out that they're B-24 bombers on the flight line, but the whole microfilm was this kind of quality photograph. You really can't pick out much of anything. And then I found out that when the base was closed by the Air Force in 1973, they took their photo collection to the landfill and threw it all away. So photographs of the airfield at Westover Field, Massachusetts during World War II are exceptionally rare. There's only, until I just recently discovered a whole group more, there's only been 3 or 4 of them known up through the years after the war. So take a look at this photo. Eventually, it's a long story, but eventually I found the original of that photo. And that's the original on the left. And where that red arrow is on the left, that's pointing at the plane that hit Camels Hump. This photograph was taken about 3 months before the crash. And if you look up in the top right, you see that right-hand arrow. It's pointing at the numbers on the nose of the plane, 1067. So that's a positive ID. That is the plane that hit Camels Hump. It was serial number 1067. This is the pilot of the plane the night that it crashed. Dave Potter from Springfield, Minnesota. He's 30 years old. By World War II standards, Dave Potter was ancient. He was an old man. And the reason he was older is because he had actually been up and served in the Royal Canadian Air Force for the first part of the war. Look at the picture. You can see Dave Potter here. He's in RCAF uniform, and he's wearing eyeglasses. Early in the war, the Americans said nobody with eyeglasses can pilot our bombers. And he wanted to fly the biggest possible planes over the longest possible distances. That was his goal. And the Canadians said, yeah, come on up. We'll train you how to fly bombers. And the Americans just let him go. You'll notice on his left breast, you can see the Royal Canadian Air Force pilot wings. And in this photo, you can barely see up in his left shoulder, Americans serving the RCAF had a U.S. patch on their shoulder. And again, in this photo, you can see Dave is wearing his eyeglasses. He was a longtime pilot. He and his family owned huge stockyards in Minnesota, and he and his brother, that's Dave Potter with his left hand on the plane wearing sunglasses. That's his brother, R.D. Potter, who was later a 747 pilot for United Airlines. They decided if they're going to cattle auctions, they should be flying to save time. So they both became pilots and flew their own plane around to cattle auctions. This is a great early photo of Dave Potter. That's him driving his brothers and sisters to school one morning off the family farm. So when the Americans wouldn't let him join the Army Air Corps because of his eyeglasses, he went up to Canada, enlisted, and that's him on the right there with the red arrow. Again, he's wearing eyeglasses, but he became an instructor pilot in the RCAF, and he was known as an extremely safety conscious, slow talking, very, very methodical pilot, which is why he became an instructor pilot. In fact, eventually they sent him out to British Columbia, assigned him his own bomber crew. This is his bomber crew here. I was able to interview the guy on the right, Ollie Verm. And Ollie told me, he said, Dave Potter was the best pilot he ever flew with in World War II. He said the guy was incredibly good. Again, notice Dave Potter's wearing eyeglasses. So while they're up at British Columbia, they were actually at a base called Patricia Bay. The Americans decided at MGM they needed to make a cool movie about Lassie flying with the Royal Air Force in England. And MGM figured Americans are dumb. They wouldn't know the difference between a Canadian uniform and a British uniform. So they went up to film this movie at Patricia Bay. And you can see here, Lassie is on the wing of the plane. The movie is called Son of Lassie. Peter Lawford was the star. And if you look behind the guy that's standing, bending over Lassie, you can sort of look in the window of the cockpit. That's Dave Potter sitting in there. He was selected to do all the flying for the movie. And Ollie Verm, by the way, told me, he said it took them 2 full days to get the poor dog to jump up on the wing because the engine was running. If you see the movie, the engine is actually running at this point with that big propeller right in front of the wing. That's a different view of the same bomber after the dog has gotten off. The airman in front of the plane is carrying Lassie, and that's Dave Potter in the cockpit. So what happened? Well, the Americans, we were losing so many bombers over Europe and the Pacific, they finally dropped the restriction on eyeglasses, and Dave Potter heard about it, resigned his commission in the RCAF, came back down across the border, enlisted in the United States Army Air Force, and posed for a photograph in his Class A tunic, his dress tunic. Notice he took his eyeglasses off for this picture. He was commissioned as a first lieutenant, a direct commission. And if you look at his tunic, you can see over his left chest now he has American pilot wings, and over his right chest are RCAF wings. He was a qualified pilot in 2 air forces. This is where he's buried in Springfield, Minnesota. On his headstone, it says, enlisted in the Canadian Air Force, August of 41, served until June of 44, pilot in U.S. Army Air Force from June of 44, killed in plane crash in Vermont mountains, October 16th, 1944. And on his headstone are the wings from the 2 air forces. His nephew, one of his nephews, just mailed me all of his medals and military insignia with a comment. He said, look, none of us knew him. No one here in the family even remembers him anymore. And you're the best memory of our uncle. So we'd like you to have all of the items off his uniform. So I have those today. Potter, however, was not the original pilot on the crew. And there's an amazing story here. The first pilot on the crew was this guy here, Eddie Stump, 18 years old. And you can see on this on the left-hand side here, this is the list of the initial crew. And it shows Second Lieutenant Edward H. Stump as P pilot. And September 21st, 1944, they all were told to go to the gymnasium at Westover Field, and there were 100 lists of crews posted on the wall, and you just look up and down the list until you came to your name, and that tells you what bomber crew you are going to be assigned to. And this is the pilot, and Eddie Stump is the initial pilot. The crew comes together, and they love this guy. He's 18 years old. He's a teenager like them. They go to parties together. Unlike most officers, he socialized with his crew. And very quickly, they became a very, very tight-knit crew. They did everything together. Now, they're missing a navigator and a bombardier because they will join the crew a little bit later. Stump was removed from the crew for unknown reasons. There's four different versions, or at least four different versions that I can come up with. But here's Ed Stump writing to me where he says, I still get very upset and outraged that the crew was taken away from me and given to Potter. I hold the Army responsible for this needless waste of these boys. So Ed Stump was bitter. He died of cancer a couple of years after I talked with him. So I asked a survivor, we're going to talk about the survivor later. I asked Jim Wilson, I said, why was Ed Stump removed? And he said, I will tell you on the condition you never relate the story until Eddie and I are both deceased. But he said he completely botched a nighttime landing, and the next morning he was gone. Ed was assigned as a co-pilot on another crew, went over to Italy in the 15th Air Force, was shot down and spent the rest of the war as a POW. Another version of it that I'll just cover here was Dick Hurd's version. Now, Dick Hurd was the commander of the squadron, and he was also later director of operations for aeronautics here in Vermont, the Vermont Department of Aeronautics. Dick was the commanding officer, and he looked at me and he said, well, I got this 18-year-old pilot in charge of this crew of 9 other crewmen. He has very little experience. And he said, along comes this 30-year-old with all kinds of experience, twin engine certified, just everything. He said, if you were the commanding officer, who would you remove and put on as the pilot of the crew? And he said, that's exactly why I did it. So that's his version of why Stump became the pilot on the crew. They were at, this is Westover Army Airfield in Massachusetts. And Westover in World War II was where the crews were assembled. They'd all be trained at different stations around the country and then brought together and assembled as a crew at Westover. Like I said, I'm going to skip through some slides in the interest of time. Here's the co-pilot, 23-year-old John Ramasaki. He was married, had an infant daughter. And if you look at on the right-hand side, he could have avoided military service. He was a machinist in a machine shop, and he spoke fluent Hungarian. His parents were Hungarian. His heritage was all Hungarian. So he could have done intelligence work as a translator or whatever. But his wife told me, or his widow told me, that all he wanted to do was fly the biggest possible planes he could get his hands on. And that's how he ended up in the Air Corps. He enlisted and became the co-pilot on this crew. And you'll notice here on the left, the nice color portrait of him. 9 of the crewmen posed for formal photographs in uniform before they were killed. Only 1 did not, and you'll see that towards the end. This is a good insight into John Ramasaki's personality, great sense of humor. I was told by several people, yeah, his sense of humor was like the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, very dry. You had to listen very carefully to what was being said before you caught the joke. And on the right-hand picture, that's John on the right, his sister in the middle, and his other brother on the left. The other brother was killed in a mid-air air collision of military planes over Manchester, New Hampshire in 1947. There was wreckage scattered throughout the city. So this family lost 2 brothers to airplane crashes. Here's the navigator. He joined the crew basically a day or 2 before the crash. 22-year-old Bob Joffrey from Sterling, Illinois. He he had his civil engineering degree from the University of Iowa. In fact, they did a big ceremony at Veterans Day last year to honor his service. Um, and his best friend I contacted, and he said, "Hey," he said, "how good is your presidential history?" And I said, "Well, it's okay." And he says, "Name a surveyor that was a U.S. president." And I said, "Well, the only two I can think of are Washington and Lincoln. And I'm not even sure about Lincoln." And he said, "No, no, no." He said, "There's another one. Ronald Reagan was once a surveyor." And it turned out Bob Joffrey and Ronald Reagan were on the same surveying crew in Sterling, Illinois at one time. He was an only child. This is him posing with his parents. Um, and if you ever saw the movie Memphis Belle about the famous World War II bomber, the opening scene is where a bomber crew has been shot down over Germany. And when everybody gets back to their barracks, they open up the foot lockers of the men who disappeared and they start divvying up their possessions, the radios, the wristwatches, the cameras, and handing it out. And it seems cold hearted, but that's the way it was in World War II. If you were shot down, your barracks mates would split up your possessions because they might be shot down the next day. Everybody knew it, everybody expected it. It was never explained to the home front. So the home front always wondered why nothing of value ever came home or rarely came home. It's because it all got divvied up overseas. So when none of Bob Joffrey's possessions came home, his mother, shown here in the right, suffered a mental breakdown from which she never really recovered. Both parents felt that this whole thing was a huge cover up and they wanted to know what happened to their son, and they never really found out. Here's the bombardier on the plane. He only joined a day or two before the crash. This is Dave McNary from Colusa, California. Now, this guy was just over 5 feet. He was a short little guy, but he was a Golden Gloves boxing champion and a rodeo champion. And one year to toughen himself up for rodeo, he drove from college in Oregon, or he rode his horse from Oregon down to Colusa, California, just to make himself tougher for the rodeo. This is the engineer on the plane, Corporal Luther Hagler. He was known as LN. I got to know his mom really well. She used to call me every Christmas Eve because she never knew what happened to her son until I started this research and I was able to explain the whole thing to her. LN was a mechanical genius. His parents and his family owned a rice farm in Arkansas, and he designed a rice harvesting machine from old scrap cars and tractors. He was making so much money renting that out to other rice farmers in Arkansas that he planned to pay cash to go through Texas A&M and get his engineering degree. Unfortunately, he was killed here on Camels Hump. Now, this is a letter. This is the last letter he wrote home to his mom 2 days before the crash. And he's talking about flying with Potter. And he says, "Well, I've flown twice with my new pilot, and he is really good. He can really fly that thing. In fact, he is better than the instructors that we have flown with." So the crew, even though their good friend Eddie Stump, they got to know and they loved him as pilot. When Dave Potter came on board as a 30-year-old, he got instantaneous respect because of his flying skills. The crew really loved this guy. Here's the radio operator, 19-year-old from Fall River, Massachusetts. His mom told me, she said, even as an itty-bitty little boy, all he wanted to do was to fly airplanes. And she said at 17, he hounded us to death to get into the Air Corps. We finally signed to let him get in before he was 18, and at 19, he's killed on Camels Hump. Now, he made a recording, a dictaphone recording that I have a few days before the crash, and in it, he says, "Oh, for the life of a gunner. They laugh and they always wisecrack. They figure they might well be happy, for they know they will never come back." There's more to the recording, but that little passage really, really strikes home with me. And his mom had never heard it until I was able to get into, at the time, a cassette recording and play it for her. And it meant so much to her to hear her son's voice 45 years after he was killed. Here's the bald turret gunner, the armorer. He was responsible for the guns in the plane. This is Bob Denton from Amsterdam, New York. He was the only other crewman that was married, and he also had an infant daughter like the co-pilot. And if you look at his picture on the right, Bob Denton's goal in life was to become an actor. And he went to acting school at St. Lawrence University with one of his closest friends, a fellow with this really, really long Greek name that he later shortened it to Kirk Douglas. So he was a good friend of Kirk Douglas, followed him all through high school, and they acted in plays together. It took me 24 years to find his widow. I finally tracked her down. She was on her fifth marriage in California. I had a wonderful interview with her, and she said, she says, I've been married 5 times. 5 husbands have died on me. And she said, but I've only ever had one true love in my life, and that was Bob Denton. This is his grave in Amsterdam, New York. Once I found her, I could find out where he was buried. She shared all kinds of memories, photos, all sorts of things that helped me learn a lot more about the crew. Here's the tail gunner. This is the photograph that I started with. An 18-year-old Richard Wynn. Remember this picture because his story is going to come back in a little bit later. But look at the letter he wrote exactly 1 month before the crash. Look at the beautiful penmanship. He wrote his dad that same day, and the letter to his dad that same day is all fully typed out. This is his headstone in Henrietta, Oklahoma. And we're going to talk about this towards the end, about what is really buried down there. Here's the nose gunner, 19-year-old Casper Zacher. He was known as Bill Zacher. He's buried in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I can spin off so many stories in this, but just to show you the depth of this story, Jim Wilson, the sole survivor, asked for a draft of a write-up that I had. It was like 80 or 90 pages long, many, many years ago, telling the story. So I sent it to him, and then he called me and he said, hey, do you mind if I loan it to a doctor that I just met? And I said, no, feel free. So Jim Wilson, the survivor, had met this doctor, Dr. Rick Sanganita, at a party. And the doctor looked at him and he said, I must ask you, why do you not have any hands or feet? And Jim Wilson said, well, because I lost them in a plane crash in Vermont during World War II. And the doctor said, well, I did my internship at a place called Mary Fletcher Hospital in Burlington, Vermont. And he says, I used to hike a local mountain when there was a World War II bomber crash, but everybody was killed in that crash. And Jim said, Camels Hump? And the doctor said, yeah, Camels Hump. And Jim said, not everybody was killed. I survived. So pretty amazing connection there to start with. And so Jim loaned him my draft of the story. And the doctor called him a couple of nights later. He said, this is unbelievable. And Jim said, why? And he said, well, when I set up my medical practice, my GP, general practitioner practices, the first family that came to me was the Zacher family. He said, I knew they'd lost a son in World War II, but holy cow, he was on the Camels Hump bomber. So just an amazing connection there, a couple of amazing connections. He's buried at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, even though on his headstone it shows North Dakota, because that's where he was actually born. Here's our sole survivor. This is the only one, if I back up a little bit, notice the formal photograph again. There's been 9 formal photographs of guys in uniform. Jim Wilson never had his photo taken in uniform until after the war. This is a 1945 photograph. The original, if you pan down further, you see his artificial hands. I find it ironic that 9 guys who have their picture taken in Class A perish. The one guy that doesn't is the sole survivor. So Jim loses both hands and both feet in this crash. Never slowed the man down a moment. We'll get into his story a little bit later. Okay, so the crash itself. The crash itself, October 16th, 1944, contrary to local legend, it was a beautiful, crystal clear evening when they started to assemble down at Westover Field. Inside the red square here, they had lined up roughly 100 B-24 bombers, And throughout Sunday evening, each crew was briefed on what they were supposed to do for training that night on a Sunday night. And this crew C505, was briefed to go out, jump into a bomber, and they had an 11th man on board. There's going to be an instructor flying with them to observe everything this night. They went out and they just jumped in the first bomber in line, and the next crew would get into the next bomber, and the next crew would get into the next bomber. So you got 100 crews getting into 100 bombers, and they've got an 11th man on board. They taxi out onto the runway. I don't have a picture of that, I guess. They taxi out onto the runway and they get a radio call. It's crazy to send an instructor pilot with Dave Potter. He is an instructor pilot. So let's get that guy back and we'll put him on with another crew. So they bring this guy back, they turn around, they taxi back out, and around 11:30 at night, they take off into the crystal clear, cold night air. And it was record cold on Sunday, October 16th, 1944. It's not bad weather, it's beautiful weather, but it is very cold. The crew had not yet been issued the electrically heated suits. It's like long johns, like underwear. You wear and you plug into the airplane and you turn it up and down just like an electric blanket. They had not been issued those yet. So as they take off, they're quite chill. This is not like an airliner. This thing doesn't have any heat in it, really. And they climb into the night air and they go up to around 8,000 feet. So who's flying the plane? John Ramasaki, the co-pilot, is flying the plane this night because the purpose of the mission is to give him some nighttime and instrument flying conditions training. So they snap in the windows around him, these felt curtains, so that he cannot look out the windows. He has to fly using purely instruments, standard procedure. That's actually one of the curtains that came out of the wreckage. And their flight plan is they're going to take off at the bottom of that red arrow at Springfield, Mass, Western Massachusetts. They're supposed to go up to Albany at 8,000 feet, go over Albany up to Burlington at 8,000 feet, turn over at Burlington at 8,000 feet, head down towards Manchester, and then turn at Manchester back to Westover Field. So they're supposed to stay at 8,000 feet all night. They take off, they go up to Albany, at which point Bob Denton, the actor, said, "Hey, let's go a little bit lower and let's circle around and I can show you the street that I live on, the high school that I went to, and that sort of thing." So they did. Jim Wilson told me they took a few turns over Albany, New York, the Amsterdam, New York area, and he's pointing out the landmarks in the ground. And then they head up towards Burlington, and now it's well after midnight, and the crew is pretty cold, so they all migrate forward. They're all pretty much sitting up in the area of the cockpit where the only heat in the plane exists. They're huddled up there. Jim Wilson said, "You know what? I'm getting flight pay. I might as well just go to the back of the plane. I'm going to lay down and take a nap back there." So he went towards the tail of the plane, laid down on the floor, packed some parachutes around himself, and he started to doze off. The crew flies up towards Burlington and at some point makes a right-hand turn over Burlington to head towards Manchester, New Hampshire. This is a bit of a faked photograph. This shows a B-24 Liberator bomber. The crew in this case would be all pretty much packed up on the left-hand side. You can see the pilot sitting up there. That's the only heat in the plane. Jim Wilson follows where I have the yellow arrow down through the bomb bay. Now, this picture shows bombs, but there were no bombs on board. He goes through the bomb bay, into the tail of the plane, and he's laying on the floor just about where that arrow ends, and he's asleep for the rest of the mission. Why'd they go down to 4,000 feet? Because that's where they're going to crash. Well, for every 1,000 feet you come down, you gain roughly 3 degrees in temperature. So they get about 3 degrees or 12 degrees warmer if they come down to 4,000 feet. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's supposed to be a conversation between the navigator and whoever's flying the plane, in this case, John Ramasaki, the co-pilot. "Hey, we want to go down to 4,000 feet. Is it okay?" The answer should be no, sir. There are mountains in front of us exceeding 4,000 feet. Well, we don't know if that conversation ever took place, but nonetheless, they came down to around 4,000 feet, someplace around Burlington, and now they're flying directly towards Camels Hump. The yellow arrow shows the flight course directly towards Manchester. That's where they should be. However, they're slightly to the left of that for whatever reason. And just below the summit at 1:58 in the morning, almost 2 o'clock in the morning, 18 inches of the left wing strikes the summit of Camel's Hump, and the bomber cartwheels around the south face of the mountain. On the right-hand side here, the arrow points. This picture was taken 3 days after the crash. You can see where that left wingtip hit. And if you go up there today, the lichens on the rock is slightly different color. Look how close to the summit they were. Again, if they went 18 inches to the right, they would have flown right past the mountain. The photograph on the left is one that I took showing where they hit. They hit right there at the point of the red arrow, and then the plane cartwheeled around to the south face, the Duxbury side of the mountain. The crew, where you see the third yellow dash, has a downward point in that dash line. The nose of the plane impacted right there, and all 9 men up the front of the plane were instantly killed and completely dismembered, except for one of them. He was pretty well intact. This is what the cockpit looked like when they started to recover the bodies. Just complete destruction of the aircraft. And I don't want to get into the real gruesome parts of it, but the bodies were badly dismembered, and they're really picking up hands, feet, small parts of humans. And on scene, the doctor that was there told me they tried to piece them back together to make complete bodies. And he said, we just gave up. He said, as soon as we felt like we had enough weight for one airman, we sent that stretcher down the mountain. So about 100 men were up there all day, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, gathering remains. And you'll see what happens later. This is what the tail section looked like 3 days after the crash. This is the right wing 3 days after the crash. This is 2 years later, where souvenir hunters have started picking that right wing apart. You can see one of the engines there. This is a 4-engine bomber. You can see one of the engines off the right wing on the left picture and another engine on the right picture. If you've ever hiked up there, this is probably the wing that you have seen. It's still up there. It's directly on the Alpine Trail, although today there's no debris around it, and the wing is bottom side up today. That's the view that you get on the right-hand side. That's the same wing today. It was flipped over by hikers sometime in the 1950s. I think I want to skip through. No, I'll tell. So this is what happened. How did Jimmy Wilson survive? Well, he's in the tail of the plane, inside the fuselage, and this is the piece of wreckage that he survived in. He was inside that when it stopped moving about roughly a third to a half a mile from the initial point of impact. When Jim Wilson was found, he was seated leaning against that arrow, or excuse me, the star you can see on the side of the plane. That's another view of that same piece of wreckage, looking back up inside it. This picture was taken 2 years after the crash. This is a view of that same piece of wreckage looking back towards the point of impact, which was, like I say, a third to a half a mile away where that arrow is pointing. So Jim Wilson survived by being inside that thing as it cartwheeled all the way across the south face of the mountain. So very quickly, the rescue, what happened? Well, the plane vanished and in perfectly clear weather. However, it was very cold, and they didn't even know where to start looking for this thing, other than the fact of where it was briefed to go. Unfortunately, by Monday morning, it started snowing, and all day Monday, all day Tuesday, it was snowing in Vermont. They couldn't search up here. Tuesday afternoon, the weather finally cleared, and a bomber flying over from Presque Isle, Maine, spotted the wreckage on the summit of Camels Hump. And that plane was crewed by the Army's Arctic Search and Rescue Crew. This was a specialty team. The commander was Captain Shearer. That's him with the white hat on the right. He told me during World War II, he says, we went to a bomber crash in Vermont, New Hampshire, or Maine, or Newfoundland at least once a week. That's how many of them were falling out of the air. These guys would go in and recover the bodies. They spotted the crash. From all their experience, they could see the complete destruction. They said there's no way anybody survived that. So their frame of mind is they're going to land in Burlington. They're going to go up there and just pick up whatever body parts they could find. They called in. There's a very detailed explanation here, but they called in map coordinates which were misplotted, and therefore the first Army crew was sent to the wrong side of Camels Hump. All the first rescuers are sent to the Huntington side when the plane is on the Duxbury side. They did say on the radio, however, that the wreckage is 80 feet below the southeast side of the summit, and to any local, you know exactly where that is, at the bottom of that head wall up at the summit. So the locals aren't paying attention to the map coordinates, but the Army is. The locals know where the wreckage is by the verbal description. So, but now they realize there's a conflict between map coordinates and the verbal description. Vermont's aeronautic commissioner goes up in his private plane trying to fly over it and spot the wreckage, but he told me he damn near killed him because the wind was blowing so hard, and he gave up on his mission and came home. So the Waterbury police chief gets a phone call to form that first rescue crew heading up the mountain based on the map coordinates, and Waterbury Police Chief John Griffiths is told go to Honey Hollow on the Huntington side because that's where the plane is. So that's where the first people go. And who is it that goes? It's the Vermont State Guard, Waterbury's Company B. Now, this is not the National Guard. The National Guard has been federalized and been sent off. Waterbury's National Guard is over in the Pacific fighting the Pacific War. This is the Vermont State Guard, which is a well-regulated militia. This is all the men in those days. It's all the men left behind. They form a home defense force, very, very formal. The Vermont State Guard still exists today. It backs up the National Guard. So this is the Waterbury Company B. They are being sent to the wrong side of the mountain. The red arrow points to Doc Edwin Steele, who's going to be detached from that because he's going to be assigned to go with the Civil Air Patrol, which Major Bill Mason from Waterbury is the commander of the Civil Air Patrol in Vermont. He realizes there's a huge discrepancy between the map coordinates and the verbal description. He can't convince the Army they're sending the guard to the wrong place. So he calls Waterbury High School, and he gets Civil Air Patrol cadets together, including his son. Doc Steele is detached from the State Guard as a medical officer, and he's going to go with the Civil Air Patrol cadets. You see the 5 on top. They're going to go up to the description 80 feet below the southeast corner of the summit, just in case. Now, the guys on the top line here make it up there. They're the ones that saved Jim Wilson's life. The other 2 CAP cadets are at the bottom. They never quite make it to the scene. And there's so much to this story, but I'm skipping through a lot of it now. So who do you have on the mountain now? You got Doc Steele and the CAP cadets. You've got Captain Shearer with his Army search and rescue crew going to the wrong place because he's using map coordinates. And the State Guard is going to the wrong place using map coordinates. Let's see here. Again, this shows you in the left-hand picture, the left wing hit that rock on the left. You can see a person standing on the summit. I've enlarged it on the right. That's how close to the summit they are. So the first people to get to the summit is Doc Steele and the CAP cadets. They're standing where this person is. They're looking down that cliff, a 300-foot cliff. And at the base of the cliff, they can see parachutes blowing in the wing, and they can smell aviation fuel. And they head down into the crash site and start running through the wreckage. When they come to the fuselage, Jimmy Wilson is sitting with his back against that star. And it's now dark. The wind is blowing. And they take Jimmy and they help him stand up and walk a few steps. They lay him down at the base of that tree you can see to the right, where that red arrow is. That tree is still there today. It's about 8 inches in diameter today. It's the last steps he will ever take on his natural feet. They wrap him up in parachutes and canvas engine covers. One of the cadets, Bob Ladd, crawls into this makeshift sleeping bag and bear hugs Wilson to keep him alive because it's now Tuesday night. He's been laying out there since Sunday night. He's hypothermic and his hands and feet are frozen with severe hypothermia. They kept him alive that night. Um, you see on the red arrow points to a ridge pole from a tent. That's the ridge pole that the boys created to create a tent over Wilson to keep him out of the wind. And that's where they survived that night. The next morning, the Arctic search and rescue crew arrives and they are astonished to find one crewman alive and being treated by one local dentist and 5 little CAP cadets. They saved his life, unquestionably. This is them bringing Wilson down the mountain. At the base of the mountain, it took 32 men the entire day to carry him down. He reaches base camp at about 3:30 on Wednesday afternoon. Again, the plane crashed Sunday night. That's Wilson on the right getting the first hot coffee that he's had, the first hot food he's had. He looks conscious here, but he doesn't really remember anything. And there are in the medical report, it said, yeah, his hands were frostbitten. They never say that it was so bad they were black. Let's see. This is the flight surgeon. Then to show you again the depth of this story, flight surgeon Dallas Wagner takes care of Wilson on the flight back to Westover Field. And this is his daughter sent me his flight log. And in it, it is very hard to read here, but they put Wilson into a plane in Burlington. They take off out of Burlington, and it says almost crashed on takeoff. Um, uh, Dr. Wagner accidentally stepped on one of the control cables and they almost crashed taking off out of Burlington. So Wilson never knew until this discovery that he survived almost another plane crash. The bodies were all taken to the Gurney Funeral Home on Spruce Street in Burlington. They spent all day Thursday, all day Friday trying to jigsaw puzzle these things back together. These crewmen, they had one intact body. There were huge arguments about, do we have 8 bodies? Do we have 9 bodies? They finally decided we have 9 bodies. Dr. Wagner here in the center readily agreed it was a medically very difficult process. Dr. Veline, the Army dentist on the right, also admitted, he said, I only had one mouth to look at. He said, we did the best we could. They sent 9 caskets home for 9 crewmen. And this is the funeral of the co-pilot, for example. This is the funeral of the engineer. 2,500 people showed up for this ceremony. 9 caskets go home, 9 funerals, 9 burials. And then the spring of next year, the publisher of the local newspaper, Milt Sunderland, the larger picture with his best buddy Les Smith, shown on the right, go up to look at the crash site. And they discovered the complete intact body of 18-year-old Rick Wynn. The Army brings Rick Wynn's body down the next day, and they tell the parents, we found additional remains of your son. What would you like us to do? And the father said, I am not putting my wife through this thing again. You guys just do whatever you think is honorable, and we'll keep this a secret from my wife. So Rick Wynn his complete intact body was buried at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, the following spring. We don't know what was in the casket in Henrietta, Oklahoma. Jim Wilson, I know we're a minute over already. I'll run through this really quickly. Jim Wilson was sent to England General Hospital in New Jersey. That's America's World War II amputee hospital. That's Jim back there facing the camera reading the letter. He loses both hands and both feet through amputation because of frostbite. Jim told me this is one of the best times in his life. He made his best lasting friendships with fellow amputees, including one here from Mike Healy, right here from Montpelier, Vermont. And Jim said it was gallows humor. Anything was funny. And he said we would do things like lower hot dogs on fishing lines out of the window down onto the street begging for food just to see what kind of response we would get. That's Bess Meyerson, Miss America, kissing Jim the following spring. Within months, he's walking on artificial feet. He got a $100,000 trust fund from the Philadelphia Inquirer. He turned it over to the Veterans Affairs, never using a penny of it. He got married in college, came back to Vermont on his honeymoon. Look at this here. He's putting the wedding ring on his wife, his bride. Went on to become an attorney. He was one of the rare attorneys that attended the McCarthy hearings in the Senate, defending Hollywood writers and actors. He risked his earliest career defending those folks because Jim did not put up with fools well. He spent a lot of the rest of his life helping veterans with the amputees. This is him dancing with his wife. As an attorney in Denver, his son told me that Jim was famous in closing arguments. He would saunter back and forth in front of the jury, slowly walk up in front of the jury, deftly pick the handkerchief out of his breast pocket, dab his forehead of sweat, at which point he had the complete attention of the jury, put the handkerchief back in and say, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," as I was saying. And he was famous for that, doing that. 1989, we had all the families come back to the Duxbury side of Camels Hump. We dedicated a monument in honor of the crew. We had 2 of the mothers there. We had all the families there, actually, except one. This is one of the mothers. This is the radio operator's mom. Her daughter told me afterwards this is the first time that her mom had peace with what had happened. This is Jim Wilson standing with his Civil Air Patrol survivors. They're all deceased now. Let's see, we're going to go. So this is another great story. 1995, I got a call from a friend of mine who said, "Hey, boy, have you read Norm Vaughn's book about the Camels Hump crash?" And I said, "No, who the hell is Norm Vaughn?" He said, "Well, he wrote a book. There's a whole chapter in it about the Camels Hump crash, how he found out where the crash site was, how he became best friends with the sole survivor, how he saved the survivor." I said, "I've never heard of Norm Vaughn. Who is this guy?" So I got the book. Total fiction. It's sold as nonfiction. He's pretty famous. National Geographic even did a special on him about how a mountain, I think the South Pole is named after him. Great explorer. Well, he wrote this whole book of nonfiction, and there's not a piece of it about Camels Hump. That entire chapter is utter fiction. I wrote the Stackpole books. They said they'd look into it and get back to me, never heard from. Little known fact, 15,000 men and women were killed in aviation accidents in World War II during training, way before they ever got to combat. There's a monument near Westover Field in honor of all the flyers that lost their lives in training at Westover Field. There's so much to the story. I've covered just some of the highlights today, but suffice it to say, you think World War II is over until you meet the relatives of the men and women who died in World War II. Until they go to their graves, that war is not over. And with that, I will end this presentation about 5 minutes or so late. And if anybody has any questions, I would certainly entertain them. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Brian. That was really interesting. Thanks a lot. Are there any questions? Oh, Ray, we can't hear you. Your voice is all garbled up. No.
Yeah, Ray, if you're talking, it sounds like Donald Duck.
Ray, you can type it into the chat.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well,
I guess you told us all the details.
I guess so. There's so much more to the story. Hopefully the book will be out in a year or two. Stay tuned.
Good. Do you know what you're going to name it yet?
Nope. No idea.
Okay, well, we'll watch for it.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for
you
having me.
coming.
Thank you, Brian. This is great.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much.
Oh, I can hear you now perfectly. Okay. Thanks, everybody.